Destiny Generation.
You gotta go out.
Know your faith.
You gotta know it to share
We
it.
have to let everyone know.
Let me tell you about it.
Share the faith.
Don't you know that my faith is important to me?
It's our destiny.
We are the Destiny Generation.
All right. How's everyone doing tonight? We're going to switch gears, okay? Going from swing dancing to the miracles of our faith, which are totally awesome. Supernatural, kind of wild, kind of weird, a little wacky kind of miracles that I think are totally fascinating, which is so, so awesome. And I'll tell you how this book came about. I've been writing these books, like this 15th book coming out in the spring. Been writing them since about early 2000s, 2002, I think was my first book. And so I'm writing for adults, and I'm writing for young kids. And people would come up to me after conferences and say, listen, you have to write something for teenagers. You have to write something for college-age kids. Because, see, I got this teenager, and she's falling away from the faith. And I got this college-age kid, and he doesn't want to go to church anymore. You know, they think Mass is boring and all this. And so I started thinking about it, and I thought, well, I was not born and raised Catholic like all of you guys probably were. I was a convert. I came into the faith as a young adult, as a 23-year-old. And I remember the very first subject that I wanted to read about and learn about the Catholic faith were the miracles. Because we had nothing like that in my nominal Protestant upbringing. We didn't have these really cool stories. So I just ate that up when I was 23 years old. I found it totally fascinating. And I moved on from there, but it was definitely my doorway into the faith. And so I wrote this book, Bleeding Hands, Weeping Stone, and that's what it's designed to do, is to talk about the supernatural aspects of our faith. And if I asked you to think about the most popular movies out there, you know, what kind of things people seek for entertainment today, and it's not just kids your age, or the young ones I spoke to this morning, or the adults, but it seems all of us are drawn to these types of movies that are about magic, science fiction, superhuman powers, mind powers, body powers, superheroes, right? Everything that is beyond normal, beyond natural, we could say it's supernatural. Now, all of us obviously know that we look at these movies and they're really cool and they're fun to watch, but they're not real, right? That's computer-generated CG stuff, okay? That's not real. But I think it's very fascinating to know there are some very, very, very supernatural things that happen, and it is found right in our very own Catholic faith, which I think is totally awesome. And sometimes when I talk to young audiences, and they really don't understand what I mean, they say, well, you know, just open the Bible. Start looking at the Bible from the Old Testament to the New, and you're going to see some really amazing things like burning bushes that talk, or prophets that were fed their dessert in the desert by ravens. You'll see people marching around the old city of Jericho, and they blow on horns and yell, and then the walls of the city come tumbling down. You'll see an angel appear to this unwed woman named Mary and predict that she's going to bear the Son of God. You hear stories about an astronomical sign in the sky so amazing that it brings these kings from faraway places to the little town of Bethlehem. And of course, we know about Jesus and his apostles and all the miracles they did, raising people from the dead, multiplying food, all kinds of things. But see, these miracles are not limited to the pages of Scripture, because God still wants to get our attention. He wants to say, yo, I am here, I am real, okay? And you just have to seek me out. And sometimes he just has to really hit us with the 2x4 and get our attention. So these miracles happen not just in Scripture, but throughout history to the very day we're living in. And what I do in this presentation in the book is I look at 6 categories of miracles in particular. The first one is Eucharistic miracles. We'll talk about that tonight. That's when the body and blood, that bread and that wine that the priest is consecrating turns into the physical, the body and blood turn into, the bread and the wine turn into the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ himself, okay? And that's a miracle that happens on every altar all around the world. The second one we're going to look at is the Stigmata. And this is times when men and women were so devout to the wounds of Jesus that they developed the wounds of Jesus in their hands, in their head, in their side, that could bleed for days or weeks or even years. We're going to talk about the phenomenon of incorrupt bodies. You know, people that were buried in the ground and escaped the decay process, the decomposition process that the rest of us normally would go through, and look like the day they died, even centuries later. We're going to talk about amazing abilities of certain saints, the abilities to do things like levitate and glow. We're going to talk about apparitions, visions that appear to people, heavenly creatures, especially Blessed Mother, come to give us really important messages at times in history. And finally, we're going to look at Catholic artwork, statues and icons and so forth that do something very strange, which is weep tears of water, oil, or blood. So these are the categories we're going to look at tonight. But there's a few points I just want to go over real quick, and I always call this my Miracle 101. But only a few basics, but I want to make sure we're all on the same page when we begin to talk about something like miracles. First of all, everything we're going to talk about tonight, you are not required to believe in. Okay, you do not have to believe in this. And I know when I said that this morning to the kids, the 13, 14-year-olds, I know they looked at me kind of strange because they think, you know, Mrs. Ficocelli, they bring you in as this Catholic expert to talk about something and you're telling me I don't have to believe in it. But the reason I say that is everything that we as Catholics need to know to get to heaven, to believe in, to get to heaven, has already been given to us in the Bible, in the magisterium teaching of the church. So that's called public revelation, that we do need to believe in. What we're going to talk about tonight is called private revelation. And I think God gives us private revelation to help give us a little boost or a nudge for our faith, you know, times when maybe we're doubting, you know, kind of slumping in our faith. These things really help give us a push forward, but you're not required to believe in them. Second really important point, we want to let Holy Mother Church be the official judge whether these miracles are authentic or not. Okay, we trust her, and she takes her time. Sometimes she takes centuries to decide if something is authentic, and she does this with three important ways. First of all, if there's an individual involved, she looks at that individual and she says, you know, is this person holy and humble, or is this person kind of seeking attention? You know, just something maybe a little unbalanced, just trying to get attention. Second of all, if there's a message involved in these miracles, is the message in line with church teaching? Okay, because it can't teach anything radical or new or divert from the faith. It has to be in line with Catholic teaching. And finally, she looks at what are the fruits of these miracles? You know, is it bringing people deeper into the faith, closer to Jesus, or is it leading them on an undisturbing path away from the church? So she looks at all those reasons before she will say something is authentic. And the reason we mostly want to trust the church is because the great imitator can fool us. And of course, who's the great imitator? Satan, of course. Satan, the powerful angel Lucifer, who fell from heaven, fell from grace. He's a very powerful angel, and he can do a lot of the things we're going to talk about today. So we always want to make sure we're staying with Holy Mother Church and her protection and her wisdom and her guidance when we talk about the supernatural. And finally, all these miracles, all these supernatural, mystical events should always lead us to Jesus. That's the reason that they've been created for us, okay? All signposts to Jesus. If they're leading us anywhere else, we don't want to get involved. All right, so now that we kind of talked about that 101, let's talk about the first miracle category, and that's Eucharistic miracles. And as Catholics, all of us know that the greatest miracle of all happens every single day on the altar of every Catholic church all around the world, and that is when that priest elevates that host, says those words of consecration, and that host becomes the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ, right? That is an awesome, awesome miracle. But the problem is we can't see that with our eyes, can we? It still looks like that little white wafer. It still tastes like wine when we sip from that chalice. So we can't perceive it with our senses. What we have to do is look at that with our eyes of faith, and then we understand and believe, but we can't see it. Well, sometimes I think through history, God wanted to help us in our unbelief. And he has willed it that there are certain times in history that that host and that wine actually turn to visible and physical blood and flesh, and that we can see it with our eyes. And these are what we would call Eucharistic miracles. The first one I want to talk about is one that happened in Lanciano, Italy, a long time ago. Look at 700s, okay? Do the math. That's over 1,300 years ago, 13 centuries. It's a really long time ago. And I think a lot of young people find this story surprising because the person in the story who had the doubts was the priest. Okay? He was a Catholic priest. He held up that little host. He said those words. But every day at Mass, he kept wondering, is this real? You know, he was doubting in his heart. He never spoke it, but he was doubting in his heart. Well, God decided to help this priest in his unbelief. And one day in the middle of Mass, in front of his entire congregation, when he said the words of consecration, that host became circled with a ring of flesh. And the chalice that was on the altar turned into 5 coagulated pellets of blood. So he obviously believed, his people all believed, the bishop approved this miracle. They put it in this really ornate display monstrance and processed it through town, and it was a great miracle. But the miracle doesn't end there. See, back in the 700s, they didn't have anything fancy like that hermetic sealing we have. You know, we have ways to preserve things. These species of flesh and blood were just put in this simple glass container, okay, not airtight. So the first miracle is 1,300 years later, this stuff shouldn't even be around. It should have dried up and decayed. But in the 1970s, which for some of you that sounds like a long time ago, but it's really modern times. In 1970s, some scientists did some investigations on this, and they determined that that circle of flesh is human heart tissue. And what they did with these blood pellets, they're hard on the outside, but when they injected needles into them, they found that it was fresh blood inside, and when they examined the properties and the chemicals in that blood, it was as fresh as if it was drawn from you or me today. Very, very interesting. Another Eucharistic miracle I like to talk about is St. Oswald of Seefeld, Austria. And Oswald lived in the late 1300s, and Oswald was a knight in shining armor, okay? But usually when you think of knight in shining armor, you think of someone good, right, a hero? Well, Oswald, before he was saint, he was just Oswald, he was not a very good knight. He was actually an obnoxious person. One day he burst into Mass, interrupted the Mass as the priest was elevating that host, and Oswald pulled out his sword, held it up to the priest, and demanded that the priest give him the priest host, which is the larger host. Well, the priest, you know, if you were held up at sword point, you'd probably do the same thing. He gave it to him. He was, you know, a little bit concerned. He gave it to Oswald, puts it in his mouth. The moment it goes into Oswald's mouth, this is an old stone church from the 1300s. Well, the stone floor softened, and Oswald sunk into his knees. And you can see this over here in this picture. And Oswald reached out to grab the altar to steady himself, and the altar softened in his hands, and his hands sunk deep into the stone altar. And at that moment, the Eucharist that was still in his mouth began to bleed profusely. And Oswald is trying to call out to remove it, remove it. And the priest removes the Eucharist, and the stone floor hardens, the altar hardens. Oswald pulls himself up out of those holes, makes a beeline to the nearest monastery where he made a very heartfelt confession. And he became a holy man. He became Saint Oswald. And if you go to Seefeld, Austria, there is a big cathedral built there, but that original altar is a side altar, and you can see the holes in the floor, and you can see the holes in the altar where I like to say the Eucharist made a big impression on Saint Oswald. Now, sometimes the Eucharist has been known to do some other really interesting things, like surviving fires and floods and being stolen. And here's a story, and look at the date, 1906. That's a century ago. It's not that long ago. But it took place in Tumaco, which is South America. And in that year, there was an undersea earthquake. Now, you guys probably are familiar with this because it's happened in recent times in Japan and before that in India. What happens when you have an undersea earthquake? Tsunami. Thank you. Yeah, so the people of Tumaco, when this happened, they felt the earth tremble, and they knew what would happen. They knew a giant wave of water, or maybe multiple waves of water, would come rushing and destroy all of them. And they got the priest, put the Eucharist in a monstrance, went to the shore, and as that great, massive wall of water approached the shoreline, the priest held up the Eucharist and made the sign of the cross, and that wall of water halted and receded, and the village was spared. Do Eucharistic miracles happen today? And the answer is yes, they do. Look at this one. Look at the date. 2001 in a town called Chiratakonam, India. Okay, that's only 12 years ago. All right, it's in our lifetime. And what happened in this miracle is that there was a priest, and he had put a consecrated host in a monstrance for an hour of adoration. And you know, this is nice that I don't have to explain what adoration is to you guys, but I have to tell you how many young people that I speak to, I have to explain what adoration is. They don't even know what that is. But anyway, you guys know what adoration is. So here he is praying with his people for an hour. And during that hour, they noticed that there were 3 dark spots that began to form on the bottom of the host. And after the benediction, the close of the hour, they all kind of looked at it closely, couldn't figure out what that could be. He locks it in the tabernacle because in India, there's very few priests. So the priests have to travel from village to village to village and do the masses and the sacraments. And so a week later, he comes back, this priest, to that parish. They open up the tabernacle, and they put this Eucharist in the monstrance. And as he's doing that, he notices there's this very, very faint image starting to appear on the Eucharist. He's not sure what it is. During the hour of adoration, as he and his people are all praying, they're looking at it, and the face is becoming more and more distinct till they can make out long hair and a beard. It's the face of Jesus on this Eucharist. And the bishop there did approve this miracle. So something so modern as 2001. But again, all of these miracles are pointing to something. What they're pointing to is the greatest miracle that happens every single day, multiple times a day, in every Catholic Mass around the world. He's trying to tell us, don't forget, I'm real. The second miracle I want to talk about is the Stigmata. And all of you know how much Jesus loved us, how much he suffered for us, that passion he went through. If you've seen The Passion of the Christ, I think they do a great job really, really depicting his suffering. And we know our Savior was pierced, right? We know he was whipped and scourged. We know he was crowned with thorns. We know his hands and his feet were pierced, his side. He shed every last drop of blood for us. That's how much he loves us. And so he went through this passion, and I always like to say, as a convert to the Catholic faith, one of the things that really drew me in was the fact that the Catholics recognize this, and you guys always have the crucifix with the body of Jesus. See, the church I grew up in, we only had the empty cross, but I love being able to see that body and remember what he did for us. Well, there's been a lot of holy men and women in history that have really thought about Jesus' passion and had a devotion to his wounds and thought about it. And in some small way, like the priest was saying this morning about consoling the heart of Jesus, they wanted to console the heart of Jesus, and they said, Jesus, please, let me just experience just a little drop of your passion, okay? It takes a lot of faith to do that. How many of us like to be hurt, right? No, I don't like to be hurt. I don't like to have a headache, let alone say, please, Jesus, let me have the crown of thorns for a couple hours today, right? It takes great, great faith and holiness. But once in a while, God would answer this prayer. And he would give that person the crushing pain of that crown of thorns, or the pains in their hands, their feet, and their side. Many times it was not visible. So nobody knew what this person was suffering. But sometimes, in some isolated cases, the wounds did become visible. And that's what we would consider the visible stigmata. And the first person that we know of who had the visible stigmata was our friend St. Francis, okay? He was a friend of the animals, a friend of the poor. He lived a very austere life, right? He fasted, and great devout Franciscan. And one day, Francis was in prayer, and he had a vision. He had a vision of a six-winged angel with the face of Jesus. And as he's looking at this vision, he suddenly feels his hands and feet pierced with this extraordinary pain. And he cries out, and he just falls on the ground. And his brothers, okay, his religious brothers in his community, come rushing over, and they see him on the floor. And when they turn him over, they're astounded, because not only does Francis have these giant wounds in his hands and his feet, but he actually has these enormous nails right through his hands and feet where the points come through and are bent over so you can't pull them back out. And as far as I know, he is the only person who's ever had the nails as well as the wounds. And he could not walk on this. He had this for the last 2 years of his life. He couldn't even walk because of those nails. He had to be carried around. And when he died, people came from miles around to venerate the wounds of this very holy priest. Actually, he was not even a priest, he was a brother. Here's someone else who had stigmata, St. Rita of Cascia. And when Rita was a little girl, she wanted to become a nun. That was her dream. But her parents wanted Rita to get married, and Rita wanted to be obedient. And so she did get married to a man. And the problem is with this man is that he was very abusive to her. He was a pagan. He didn't share her Catholic belief. He really treated her terrible. And she was like St. Monica, who prayed for Augustine all her life, her son. This woman prayed for her husband her whole life. And as bad as he was to her, finally, on his deathbed, he converted. So she saved his soul, which was really neat. Now, she had 2 sons with this man, and both of these sons died. And I had a girl in my audience this morning who told me something that I didn't know either. I thought Rita's sons had died in an accident, or I wasn't sure how they died. The girl told me she did a report on Rita. She said that the sons were going to have some vengeance on someone. They were going to try to kill someone for some reason, and she didn't want them to have that mortal soul, that sin on their soul. So she prayed to God for a natural death for the 2 of them, and both sons died like that. So I thought that, that'd be a very tough prayer for me as a mom to say that. But anyway, so Rita was suddenly left without the husband, without the sons. She decides to pursue her childhood dream of becoming a religious sister, and she goes from convent to convent. Nobody wants her because she's been married. She's had children. They're not interested. Finally, the Augustinians take her in. she becomes a very holy nun. And she had a great, great love for Jesus, and especially for his passion. And she too prayed, oh, Jesus, let me just share a little portion of your passion. And she received one single thorn mark in her forehead. And people said that sometimes when she was praying, they saw light emitting from this thorn mark. Well, the thing with Rita is most of the time when people have stigmata, it will either be, there's never an infection, but for true stigmata, but there's no odor or anything, or sometimes there's even a beautiful odor of like flowers. In Rita's case, her one thorn mark on her forehead gave out this hideous, hideous odor. It was so bad they had to put Rita way at the end of the convent in a cell all by herself for the last 15 years of her life. Okay, it was a real torture for her, a real cross, a real burden. But she carried it out faithfully. A few days before she died, Rita had visions of Jesus and Mary, and the wound began to emit a beautiful fragrance of roses. They said after her death, for weeks and weeks and weeks, they could smell the roses in her room. But our most famous case of stigmata is our friend Padre Pio. And he lived in recent times. I mean, he only passed away in 1968, so, I mean, he was alive when I was a kid. And he had a lot of mystical gifts. Padre Pio, when he would do Mass, they said he would take on, like, the persona of Jesus. I mean, he would sweat and bend over when he was talking about, the getting ready for the consecration, like he was carrying the cross of Jesus. He really became Jesus at that moment for the people in the Mass. He also had the gift of reading hearts. So people would come from, all over Europe to make a confession with him because he could read hearts and help people there. But his greatest and most famous, I think, mystical gift was the stigmata. Padre Pio's, his wounds in his hands were so large that they said you could see daylight through them. And they bled for 55 years to the day he died. That's the longest case of stigmata that we have on record. So really, really interesting. Does stigmata happen today? And the answer is yes, it does. Here's a reported case of stigmata. A man named, it's a priest, Father Zlatko Sudak. He's a Croatian priest. He developed the stigmata first as a wound as in the shape of a cross on his forehead. And he developed it, ironically, on the day that Padre Pio was canonized. Well, it's modern times, so they whisked him off to Rome, and they did an investigation, right away. They determined that this was not something of natural origin. In other words, this man was not cutting himself. They didn't understand how the wound appeared. They wanted to study it, because remember we said the great imitator can fool you, right? So what they wanted to do with this man, because right after that he began to develop all these other gifts, full stigmata, all these different mystical gifts. So they wanted to be careful because Padre Pio, right before, sometime before he died, he was getting such a following. He was like becoming almost a superstar in the minds of some people. And the church became afraid that Padre Pio was going to distract people from Jesus. So they actually put Padre Pio like in seclusion towards the end of his life, kind of kept him away from those big public masses and stuff. And so with this priest, they're kind of doing the same thing. They put him on this remote island in Croatia, and he gives retreats, but he's really off the beaten track because they just want to wait, and they want to watch, and they want to observe. I want to tell you another little side story, too. I speak at a lot of conferences, and I was speaking in Chicago at a Marian conference last October, and a woman came up to me after I did this presentation. I do this one a lot at Marian conferences, and she said, I want you to meet someone. She kept telling me all day, I want you to meet someone, I want you to meet someone. And I was like, okay, and so finally, she pulled me in this closet, like off this. I'm like, what is it with this woman? What is it? She takes out her cell phone and she shows me this picture. And it's this young man, like in his 20s, and he's got these big wounds, according to the pictures, wounds in his hands, and wounds, actually his wounds were right here and above his ankle. And I was like, wow, looks like stigmata. She said, this is my son, and he's here, and I want you to meet him. And I put it in God's hands. I said, God, if you're supposed to, have me meet this person, make it happen. There was some kind of lunch thing where there were a lot of priests there, and they were all going to go up. It was in a hotel banquet room where the presentation was, and priests were going to go up there and kind of, look at this kid and everything. Well, I didn't get to do that, and so I said, all right, Lord, if I'm not supposed to meet him. But at the end of the day, sure enough, I got pulled over by this woman and her son, and I met him, and I held his hands in mine. He keeps it very much under wraps. He's put himself under the charge of his bishop, actually a couple of bishops, and he's been to Rome now being investigated. So I just wanted to share that because when I looked at this kid's hands, they were the wounds were the size of quarters. They were very deep, maybe a quarter-inch deep with very dried, coagulated blood in them. Not any sign of infection. So if this kid was gouging himself with a knife to get attention, cut himself like so many unfortunate kids are doing today, that you would have had streaks of red, you have had swollen hands, and he had no sign of that. And it's really interesting. And he's only been Catholic for 3 years, has no idea what stigmata is. Very interesting. We'll see what happens with him. Next category I want to talk about is incorrupt bodies. And we know that when we die, we get put in the earth, right? And dust to dust, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. We are going to decay. We're going to break down, decompose. We're organic. We are like plants and animals in that regard. We're going to decompose. Well, sometimes God has willed it that there are certain individuals he's preserved from that natural process, okay? And maybe he just wants to show us that there is something beyond this life, that there's something greater. And so the process of being preserved, like the day you die, is called incorruption. Now, sometimes, especially when I talk to young audiences, they hear incorruption and they think Egyptian mummies, okay? Well, the Egyptians were, they're a very smart culture, and they had a wonderful way to figure out how to save bodies. Remember that in Egyptian studies, they believed that you need your body for the afterlife. Remember that? And so they learned how to use heat and salt and the shape of a pyramid to trap energy forces to preserve bodies. But mummies, when archaeologists dig these things up, if you touch them, they kind of just crumble to dust. This is not incorruption, okay? This is man's attempt at preserving a body. Incorruption is when they take those bodies out of the earth, even centuries later, and these people still have eyelashes and hair, and they can move. They're flexible, pliable. Okay, normally rigor mortis sets in, and people become very stiff. A corpse becomes very stiff. So that's what we're talking about, incorruption. And the first person I want to mention about incorruption is St. Catherine of Bologna, and she lived in the 1400s, and she was a holy nun from Italy, a very smart woman. She left us many holy writings. When she died, miracles started happening at her gravesite. And so the sisters, the religious sisters, got permission to exhume her body, to dig up her body. And when they dug up St. Catherine, and it was almost a year after she had died, her body was perfectly preserved. And, back then, religious orders, they used to put, the bodies of their religious right in the ground. They didn't even give them a casket, a coffin, right in the earth. And yet, although she'd been in the earth for a year, her body was perfectly preserved. So the sisters, word got out, my gosh, Catherine of Bologna is incorrupt. So people wanted to come and venerate her body. And her case was being examined for sainthood and all that. Well, so what the sisters would do, if people came to the convent and said, we want to see the body of St. Catherine, they put her on a stretcher, and they brought her out, and they let people venerate her, and then they brought her back in, and, that probably got really old for some nuns to be carrying around someone on a stretcher. So then they got the brilliant idea, she's pliable, she's flexible, so we're going to sit her in a chair, and we're going to put her in a box, closed-in box on wheels, and when people want to venerate the body, they will wheel out the box, and they'll open the door, and there's St. Catherine, or she wasn't saint yet, there's Catherine, and they can venerate her, then they'll close the door, and then they'll wheel her back. So that was going on for a while. Then one of the sisters had a dream, and Catherine appeared to her in a dream, and she said, I wish my body to be put in the main chapel for people to venerate. So they put St. Catherine's body in a beautiful throne, in an ornate throne. They surrounded her with candles everywhere, and they burned those candles for about 400 years. And if you know anything about candles, soot and wax, from candles, that residue really, really dries things out. And this is what happened to Catherine. That's why she looks a little bit like the Egyptian mummies I just showed you. She got quite dark. So since then, they've put a big plexiglass plastic, booth around her, she's encased now to prevent any further damage. Because sometimes that's what happens with these bodies when they're brought out of the earth and they're so perfect. Sometimes just the exposure then to a different kind of light, moisture, temperature can kick in the decay process, rather. Sorry. So sometimes the bodies do change after they're brought up. Sometimes incorrupt bodies are known to do some pretty amazing things. And this is the case with St. Charbel Makhlouf, who lived in the 1800s. And St. Charbel was a Lebanese monk and a hermit for the last 23 years of his life. He ate scraps, slept on the floor, that kind of a holy individual. When he died, people began to report lights at his gravesite. And so, the rumor got out, something about Charbel. So they got permission, the religious brothers, to exhume his body. When they dug into the grave, it was a flooded grave. Water had gotten in there. And water is a really strong decaying agent. Okay, if you want to ever rot something, put it in water, and it will really break down fast. Well, these other corpses that were in this grave were all rotted, except for Charbel. He was perfect like the day he died. So they took Charbel's body out of the grave, washed it, cleaned it, put it in a new religious habit, okay, put him in a coffin, and then they sealed him in the wall of the monastery, which is sometimes the way people are entombed. Well, a couple months later, someone noticed this trickle coming underneath the wall. And they're wondering, what the heck is that? And so they opened up the wall, and they opened up the casket, and they discovered that there was about 2 or 3 inches of a thick fluid in the casket all around the body. And they couldn't figure out what this is, but people began to dip cloth into this fluid, and they used to take it home to the people who were sick or who were injured, whatever, and miracles started being reported through the use of this fluid. Well, they washed his body, dried his body, put him in a new habit, put him in a new casket, put him back in another tomb in the wall. Same thing later. They see the trickle coming out underneath the wall. And when they exhumed him again, the casket was filled with fluid. And miracles again reported when people would dip cloth into it and take these pieces of cloth home. And he's been exhumed about 4 or 5 times. The last time was in the 1950s, and they've not exhumed him since. I think it's because of all that repeated exposure to the light, to the moisture, to the air, that he has started to decay. But it's really interesting what's happening with his body. But our most famous case of incorruption is St. Bernadette, a Subaru of Lourdes, the one who saw Our Lady of Lourdes. And she really truly looks like she's sleeping, and her body is in a glass enclosed casket in Nevers, the convent she lived in. She's a beautiful example of incorruption. So now the question is, does incorruption happen today? And this becomes tricky to answer. The reason is, in modern times, we've learned to do a lot of techniques to preserve the body. The body of this person up here, John the 23rd. Well, when John the 23rd died, he's the guy who started Vatican II, and people had a feeling that this guy could be important. He is blessed, by the way, so he is on the process to be canonized. So what they did was they injected him full of formaldehyde, okay, and they put him in a lead-lined and zinc casket, airtight, temperature-controlled, and so he is preserved, but through man-made process. Okay, we know who this is, right? Padre Pio. A lot of people think Padre Pio is a true incorrupt. He's not. When they exhumed him, he was partially decayed, especially half of his face. But they restored it through the use. I heard someone that worked at Disney did this. I don't know if that's true. But they restored him, and so he looks like the day he died. So neither of these cases could really be considered a true incorruption because man has intervened with his science, with his techniques to preserve these bodies so we can still venerate them and appreciate them. But that doesn't mean that there aren't incorrupt bodies in the earth that we haven't discovered yet. Now I want to kind of talk about some amazing abilities of the saints and the holy people. And the first one I'm going to talk about is luminosity. And luminosity is the ability to glow. Like it might be, I'll take that off for a second. It might be the ability to, someone may be deep in prayer and a light is shining out, like from inside to the outside, like they're glowing. Or it might look like a spotlight shining down on that person while they're in prayer. It might be sparks shooting out of their eyes or their fingertips. That would be luminosity. And in the Bible, the greatest case of luminosity, of course, is Jesus himself, when he transfigured, the transfiguration on Mount Tabor. And he was showing us what our resurrected bodies were going to look like. And if you also remember from the New Testament is St. Stephen the martyr. When he was being stoned to death, the first martyr for Jesus, as he looked up to heaven, we don't know what he saw, but they said his face was glowing before he died. Maybe he saw angels, maybe he saw Mary, maybe he saw Jesus. I don't know who he saw. We didn't see Mary, but he saw Jesus. Just like I said in the beginning with miracles, they're not just limited to Scripture, they happen in history. Here's 2 other examples of luminosity. This first one is St. Ignatius of Loyola, who lived in the late 1400s to 1500s. And this was a man that they said was often seen with a flame above his head, I even heard a funny story once that he was preaching at Mass, and one of the altar servers thought he was on fire and went to get a bucket of water and realized that it wasn't, a natural fire. It was a supernatural fire. And he had a friend, a contemporary, named St. Philip Neri, and he lived in the 1500s. And St. Philip Neri, they said sparks would shoot out of his eyes when he preached. He was so passionate when he preached. And his body radiated so much heat that he had to keep his windows open all year long. Another very strange gift is the gift of levitation, and that's the gift to rise off the ground without, breaking the bonds of gravity, without, any ropes or any strings or anything like that. St. Teresa of Avila lived in the 1500s, and she had a lot of mystical gifts, but she was known to levitate. She would get so into the Mass that as she was deep in prayer, she'd begin to rise off the ground a couple of inches. And they said her religious sisters used to have to hold her down during Mass, like kind of sit on her, so she wouldn't distract people. But could you imagine, picture that in your head, like a bunch of nuns like in a football huddle, in the first pew, trying not to keep this one from floating off the ground and distracting people. St. Joseph of Cupertino, he was known as the flying saint because he didn't just rise a few inches, he rose feet off the ground. He could fly the length of a school bus. His own Pope, Urban VIII, witnessed him doing that. He would elevate to the high altar and hover there for long periods of time. And there were some people that were a little bit jealous of St. Joseph and wondering, how can he do that? And so they locked him in a cell towards the end of his life, and just, for the last maybe year or so. And I like to think that maybe still, while he was locked in there, his heart still soared for Jesus. Now, some people have been known to do some kind of strange movement, not just feet, not just inches, but to actually different places and different times. I don't know if any of you know, she's Venerable Josefa Menendez. She was a Spanish nun. She lived in the late 1800s to the 1900s. And she preceded Faustina in that Jesus appeared to her and talked about his mercy. But he was telling her, if people don't understand my mercy, they're going to go to hell because of their sins. They're not turning to me for my mercy. And he wanted to let Josefa know what hell was like. And so her gift, if you could call it a gift, is that Jesus took Josefa to experience hell several times in her life. And she was in this cloistered convent, and yet she would disappear for hours on end. The sisters would look for her everywhere. Sometimes they would find her locked in a closet, and they would open this door, and there she was, and her religious habit was all like smoking and singed and smelling like sulfur. And she has a book, it's called like The Divine Way. If you ever read it, I tell kids, it will scare the hell out of you because she describes hell so poignantly. It is a place none of us ever, ever, ever want to go to. So if any of your friends ever say, oh, I don't believe in hell, point them to Josefa Menendez. It's very, very convincing. Sometimes people have been known to do another kind of movement, and this is bilocate. That means to be in two places at once. Would that not be a cool gift, right? You could be here, but you could also be skateboarding out there somewhere or anything. That would be fun. And Padre Pio, what he used to tell people, his brothers, is like it was extending God's personality, to be two places at once. He could not only be in his convent in Italy, he could be, in Africa or America, visiting someone in the hospital. He could comfort someone who was dying, predict someone who was going to be facing death, or predicting someone who was going to be cured. He could carry objects with him when he bilocated and bring objects back to the monastery. He even confided to his brothers that he could trilocate, which is to be three places at once. So really cool. There's another mystical gift that some of the saints had, and that's the gift of tongues. And the gift of tongues expresses itself in a few ways. It could mean speaking this mysterious language of the angels. Has anyone ever heard someone speaking in tongues? Okay, the gift of speaking or interpreting tongues. It's a little strange if you ever hear it. It's kind of beautiful too, but it's a little strange. That's one gift. Sometimes it's the gift of suddenly being able to speak and understand a language that you never studied in school. Like, bam, you can speak Russian, or you can speak Spanish, or you can speak German, instantly. Another gift is to speak to animals. Okay, some saints will be able to speak to animals. Well, St. Anthony of Padua was probably our most outstanding saint that had the gift of tongues. He was considered the greatest preacher of all times. And there's a wonderful, wonderful story of him that one day he's out there preaching to the people out there in Italy, and they were heckling him. They didn't want to listen to him. They were just a tough, tough crowd. Not like you guys. You're a great crowd. But they were a tough crowd, and they're heckling him. He finally turned out of frustration to the sea behind him, and he began to preach a homily. And all the fish, they said, stuck their little heads out and listened to his homily. And when he was done, he blessed them, and they all put their heads back under the water and swam away. And many, many people were converted that day. And when his canonization process was opened and they exhumed his body, he had decayed. His body was decayed like we normally would decay, except for his tongue and his larynx and his voice box. That was perfectly preserved, probably because he was the greatest preacher of all time. Okay, do these miracles happen today? Yes, they do. They do. These mystical miracles of abilities of saints do happen. We have two contemporary people. They lived in the 1900s. It's St. Andre Bessette from Canada and Venerable Solanus Casey. I just met someone at this campground who's related to Solanus Casey. Who in this room? Anyone in this room? Okay, but in my last presentation, we have someone who's related to him. Both of these guys were amazing in their gifts of healing. They had extraordinary powers of healing given through God, and also the gift of prophecy. So these gifts do exist in our modern times. Okay, next category we're talking about is apparitions. And apparitions are visions from heaven that tell us important messages for different time periods in history. And we know that Scripture was full of apparitions. They were all angels, okay? We know angels appeared to Abraham and to Sarah and told them they're going to have a son named Isaac in their old age. We had the angel appearing, as we said in the beginning, to Mary to tell her that she was going to bear the Son of God. We had angels appearing in the fields over Bethlehem, telling the shepherds about the baby being born. And we had the angels appearing to Joseph, saying, get up, wake up, take your wife, take your child, and flee to Egypt because of Herod. So angels are all throughout the Scriptures doing these apparitions, giving warnings, giving important messages. But they've happened throughout history as well. And I know that these are going to be probably, most of these are very, very familiar to you. But in the 1500s, in 1531, there was the apparitions of Guadalupe, Mexico, where Our Lady appeared to Juan Diego, a peasant, a convert to the faith. As a result of these apparitions in a very troubled time, the troubled time was the Aztecs were committing human sacrifice by the tens of thousands every year. And she told Juan she wanted a temple built there to bring people to her son. And the great miracle was the conversion of some 9 million Indians in about 10 years. It was phenomenal. So great miracle. This one, we know Fatima. This place today, your apostolate here for the family consecration would not exist without these miracle that happened in Fatima, Portugal in 1917, almost 100 years ago, when 3 children in the field were tending their sheep and they saw the flashes of light in the sky, thought it was lightning. As they were gathering their stuff, they see this beautiful illuminated lady appear above a small tree in the field. And she introduces herself as Our Lady from Heaven, and she gives them messages. She has them come back on the 13th of every month. Of course, the miracle of the sun is the last thing. She made many predictions. They all came true. But she came to us at that time because the world was in the break of World War I. It was a terrible, terrible time, and she warned us what would happen if we don't pray the rosary, if we don't fast, if we don't turn our hearts back to Jesus. This one you may not be as well known about. This happened in Zaytun, Egypt, and pretty modern times, 1968 to 1971. 3 years, very turbulent time in the Middle East, okay, terrible clashes between the Israelis and the Arabs. And this place, Zaytun, it means peace, and they say that the Holy Family stopped in Zaytun, Egypt, on their flight out of Israel to escape Herod. And it's a mixed area. There are Jews there. There are a lot of Muslims. And there are a lot of Coptic Orthodox Catholics. Those are like our cousins, the Eastern cousins of ours, okay? They're not part of our Catholic Church, but they're like our next of kin. And one night, some garage workers across the street of this Coptic Eastern church were working, and they look up and they see this lady up here, and they thought it was a woman that's going to jump, okay? They got scared. And they're looking, and this crowd is gathering, and they're realizing she's not standing there, she's floating. She's just floating. She's not speaking, and she's got this illumination going on, the crown around her head, or illumination around her head. And she appears, never speaking, but she appears on and off for 3 years. This was caught on Egyptian television. It was photographed. This is one of the actual photographs, tons of photographs. The president of Egypt witnessed this miracle, and the Eastern Church has approved it. So very, very modern times. And do these miracles happen today? Yes, in more reported apparitions happening every day, over and over, every day, increasing numbers. So Our Lady's trying to tell us something important, so we want to watch for that. Last category I want to talk about is weeping statues and artwork. We Catholics, we love our artwork, don't we? I mean, if you come to my house, you're going to know I'm Catholic. You're going to know before you ever open my door because I got statue up front, you know, I got the picture of Divine Mercy, you know, got Sacred Heart of Jesus, and we love our artwork, right? But sometimes our non-Catholic friends wonder, why do you Catholics love that artwork? You know, do you worship that? Of course, we don't worship our artwork. We have this beautiful artwork because it reminds us of Mary, reminds us of Jesus, reminds us of the saints, reminds us of angels. We don't worship the stuff. But sometimes our Catholic artwork has been known to do very, very unusual things, and that is to weep tears of oil, water, or blood. And all these miracles I'm going to talk about in this category, if you notice, are very, very contemporary. Look at this date, 1953. And this one happened in Syracuse, Italy. And it was involving a young couple who got married. And they were not particularly religious, okay? But they got this gift, a wedding gift, and it was the Blessed Mother on this black background, kind of like a three-dimensional kind of bust of Mary. And they hung it above their bedroom, their bed. And the woman got pregnant right away, which was a great joy. They were wanting to have a child. But right away, the pregnancy went bad, and complications set in, and the child was at risk, and the mother was at risk. She had to stay in bed the entire pregnancy. So she was suffering a great deal, and one day she's laying in bed, and she feels water on her head, like drips of water, and she's looking up, and she's wondering, what on earth is this? And she realizes it's this artwork above her bed is crying tears. And she calls in her family, and it's a little village in Italy, so in about 2.5 minutes, the entire village is in their house to see this miracle. Everyone's like, go get mama, go get papa. So they'll come over. So many people crowded this little house that they put the artwork outside, and people are dipping those cloths into the tears and reporting miracles. Well, the bishop over there immediately did an investigation. He had them take apart the back, look for wires, look for batteries, look for tricks, look for hoax, whatever. He couldn't find anything, and he declared that this was an authentic miracle. Another one, 1973, even closer to our time, Akita, Japan. And this miracle involves this woman over here. Her name is Agnes Sasagawa. In 1973, Agnes was a lay member of a religious community, and she became deaf in both ears. And the sisters took her in, and they made her sister, Agnes Sasagawa. And right away, things began to happen with this religious sister. First, she began to see lights glowing around the altar during Mass in their little chapel. And she began to experience her guardian angel, the presence of her guardian angel at her side while she was in prayer. But the most unusual thing was there was this 3-foot wooden statue that was on the side of the altar, and 3 times Sister Agnes saw this statue come to life and speak to her. And this statue would, as Mary would give these messages that something terrible is going to happen if people didn't convert, chastisements that could happen to the world. Agnes developed stigmata. The statue begins to develop stigmata in her right palm, just like Agnes had. The statue had predicted in this apparition that Agnes was going to become cured of her hearing. She became cured of her hearing. Now, the community could not see this statue come to life and speak to Agnes, but what they could see is at 101 separate occasions, they saw this statue weep tears, mostly of water, but sometimes of oil or blood. And the bishop there investigated this miracle and has proved it. This is a miracle that sometimes people ask me, don't miracles happen in our country? What about the United States? It's always Italy, Italy, Italy. What about the United States? Well, here's something that you might know of. Her name is Audrey Santo. Audrey, when she was 3 years old, fell into her family's swimming pool, and she clinically drowned. They rushed her to a hospital, and in their attempts to revive her, they over-medicated her. There was some kind of complication, and Audrey ended up in a coma. She was unresponsive. She could not eat. They had to feed her through a feeding tube. Just really like catatonic, non-responsive. And some people would have said, pull the plug. Some people may have said, just put her in a home. But this family said, no, we're going to take her home. And the story had made the newspapers tragic, a 3-year-old drowning in her pool. And so people came to see this little girl, and they would pray by her bedside. Well, some strange things started happening right away in Audrey's house. First of all, people began to smell roses in her bedroom, And as people are praying for their own reasons, miracles are starting to be reported by the people, like they were being cured of diseases and that kind of thing. Audrey developed signs of stigmata on her body. Priests began to come and, with the permission of the bishop, said Mass in her bedroom. And on 5 separate occasions, there were Eucharistic miracles in her bedroom. But probably the most phenomenal, I think, miracle with Audrey is that everything started to weep. It started with this big picture of Our Lady of Guadalupe that hung in the living room over their piano. It began to weep oil. And then it seemed like everything in Audrey's room, every statue, every icon, every picture, even the walls themselves at times were weeping. Okay, it's really, really interesting. So she died in 2007 of the complications of her injury, of her accident, but her case is being investigated by Rome right now. So these miracles are still happening in our day. Now, what I want to do as a final thing with you guys tonight is I want you to use your imagination, and I want you to visualize something with me. I want you to go in your mind and picture the most beautiful cathedral you've ever seen in your life. And, I just picked this one up off the internet. This is not the most beautiful cathedral I've ever seen, but just picture something, really ornate, those spires and carved angels that are just smiling at you as you're approaching this gorgeous, gorgeous church, and maybe the bells are ringing. and you walk up the massive steps, okay? Can you picture this kind of a cathedral? And there's big mahogany doors, and you push open these mahogany doors, okay? You with me in your imagination? And you enter this lobby of this church, and it's a small room, but it is the most beautiful room you've ever seen. And there's incense burning, and there's candles glowing, and there's light streaming through the stained glass windows, and there's flowers, the smell of flowers, and you think you have arrived at heaven. It is the most beautiful place, the coolest place you've ever been to. You want to stay here for a really long time. Well, if in your imagination now you decide, okay, I'm going to turn around, I'm going to go back through those mahogany doors, I'm going to walk down those steps back home, you've forgotten to do something. What have you forgotten to do? You've forgotten to go through the next set of doors into the heart of the church, into the main building of the church, right? The sanctuary, the reason why that church was built in the first place. The part of the church where we encounter Jesus in those sacraments, especially in the Eucharist, okay? The heart of our faith. The reason I use that analogy, I think it's helpful when we think about the supernatural, the mystical miracles of our faith. The miracles and supernatural aspects of our faith are like a doorway. They're like a lobby into our faith. They're a great way to get into the faith. At 23, they got me into the faith. But it's not a place we need to stay at or want to stay at. We want to enter deeper. These miracles happen to invite us to enter deeper into our faith with Jesus, into those sacraments, the liturgy, the Mass, and that is the real miracle of our Catholic faith. If you've liked what I talked about tonight, the book is called Bleeding Hands, Weeping Stone. It's on the book table today. It'll be there all week. Feel free to come and check it out. And I want to thank you again. You guys are such an awesome audience. God bless you and have a great week here at Catholic Family Land. Bye-bye.